It all began innocently enough, or at least that's how I convinced myself at the time. The Galactic Research and Exchange Program had been running smoothly for several decades, allowing scientists from all corners of the known universe to visit Earth and engage in direct research on our biology, ecosystems, technology, and cultural customs. I had always been an enthusiastic participant in the program, being a xenobiologist who specialized in understanding the physiological and psychological aspects of different alien species. But nothing, absolutely nothing, could have prepared me for Zarin, my latest guest. The Lyrassians were a species that had garnered quite the reputation among Earth's scientific community for their remarkable advancements in genetic manipulation and biotechnological integration. Their sleek, silver-scaled bodies and their bioluminescent glow were subjects of admiration. They were visually arresting, yes, but it was their intellectual prowess that made them both fascinating and a little intimidating. Zarin, in particular, seemed to embody the most extreme aspects of their species' famous curiosity. When I first met Zarin, I could tell immediately that this was no ordinary research exchange. Standing nearly 6 feet tall, their slender form glowed faintly, illuminated by the delicate network of biocircuitry embedded in their skin. Every few moments, their bioluminescent scales shifted color, reflecting their current emotional state. Initially, Zarin's scales radiated a calm, neutral white, a standard baseline for the Lyrassian species during diplomatic encounters. "Dr. Reynolds, it is a privilege to study alongside you," Zarin said upon our first meeting, their voice slightly synthetic but not unpleasant. "I have heard much about your work in comparative xenobiology." "Thank you, Zarin," I replied, unsure whether to shake hands or follow some alien custom. The Lyrassians didn't seem to have rigid physical greetings, so we settled on a polite nod. "I'm looking forward to learning from you as well. I understand your people have made considerable advancements in regenerative medicine?" Zarin's scales shimmered slightly as they responded, "Indeed, regeneration is just one aspect of our expertise, but my interests today are more fundamental." That statement hung in the air between us, intriguing and somewhat foreboding. I wasn't quite sure what they meant at the time, but I didn't press the issue. After all, I was dealing with a fellow scientist, not a diplomat, and the specifics of their research would reveal themselves in time. The first few days of Zarin's visit were spent on relatively harmless topics. They admired Earth's flora and fauna, expressed amazement at our ability to conserve biodiversity despite industrialization, and spent long hours reviewing the genetic studies we'd performed on various alien species in the past. It wasn't until the third day, during an informal conversation over dinner, that things took an unexpected turn. "I must confess," Zarin said, their violet eyes gleaming with what I could only describe as intellectual hunger, "I find human reproduction to be a particularly intriguing subject." I almost choked on my water. Out of all the things we could have discussed, terraforming, space travel, or the neurological complexities of the mind, they wanted to talk about reproduction. "Well, yes," I managed to stammer. "Human reproduction is of course a basic biological process. It's not all that different from other mammalian species." Zarin tilted their head slightly, their glowing eyes narrowing in contemplation. "That's what I find fascinating. It is both simple and complex. There is the biological act, yes, but humans seem to place such great emotional importance on it. In our studies, we have noted the intricate connection between your species' reproductive practices and your social structures, your familial bonds, and even your psychological health." I nodded, not entirely sure where they were going with this. "That's true. Human reproduction is deeply tied to emotions, relationships, and cultural values." Zarin's bioluminescence shifted to a light blue, an indication of deep curiosity in their species. "Our species views reproduction as a purely biological function. We have long since divorced any emotional attachment to the process. Genetic material is selected for the most desirable traits, and the offspring are incubated in biotechnological wombs. It is efficient, but I suspect it limits our understanding of the more intimate aspects of biology." There was something in the way Zarin said "intimate" that made me uncomfortable, though I couldn't quite put my finger on why. I decided to keep the conversation professional. "Well, each species has its own way of continuing its existence. Humans tend to emphasize the emotional connection because it strengthens our bonds with each other and ensures a higher level of care for offspring." Zarin leaned in slightly, their glowing eyes never leaving mine. "Exactly, and that is why I am here, Dr. Reynolds. I want to understand. To fully comprehend the depth of human reproductive practices, I must go beyond theoretical knowledge." My eyebrows shot up in surprise. "Go beyond theoretical knowledge?" Zarin nodded, their scales shimmering a brighter shade of blue. I have reviewed all the available material, biological texts, simulations, recorded data, but I feel the only way to truly understand human reproduction is through empirical observation. A field study. My mind raced to keep up. What exactly were they proposing? What kind of field study? I asked hesitantly, unsure whether I wanted to know the answer. Zaren's eyes lit up with an intensity I hadn't seen before. I want to experience it. The air between us became unbearably thick. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Experience it? I repeated, not entirely sure I'd heard correctly. Zaren's tone remained clinical, as if they were discussing a mundane scientific experiment. Yes, I believe I could replicate certain aspects of human biology within my own body, mimicking the necessary organs for reproduction. I would, of course, require assistance in performing the act. I blinked, struggling to process the sheer audacity of what they were suggesting. You want to test human reproduction yourself? Zaren tilted their head again, their bioluminescent lines pulsing with curiosity. Precisely. It is purely scientific, Dr. Reynolds. I assure you, this is not an attempt to provoke or offend. If I am to truly understand your species, I must immerse myself in your ways. I seek to understand not just the biological mechanisms, but the emotional and psychological elements that you describe as essential to the process. I stared at them, momentarily speechless. How was I supposed to respond to that? On the one hand, I understood their scientific rationale. Zaren was a researcher, driven by a desire to comprehend the nuances of human biology. But on the other hand, this was about as personal as it got. The idea of testing human reproduction, as if it were some casual experiment, was not something I'd ever thought I'd have to deal with as a xenobiologist. Zaren, I said slowly, trying to choose my words carefully, I'm not sure that's a good idea. Human reproduction isn't just a physical process, it's deeply personal. Zaren's scales shifted to a soft lavender, an indication of confusion. Isn't the purpose of science to uncover knowledge, no matter how personal? If there are emotional elements to the process, I would expect you to be the ideal candidate to explain them to me. It was hard to argue with their logic, even if the situation made me incredibly uncomfortable. But I needed time to think, time to figure out how to navigate this awkward situation. Let me think about it, I said, hoping that would give me enough time to figure out a way to politely decline. Zaren nodded, apparently satisfied with that answer. Of course, Dr. Reynolds, I value your input as a colleague and a fellow scientist. I will await your decision. As Zaren left the room, I exhaled slowly, realizing that this exchange was going to be far more complicated than I had anticipated. Chapter 2, The Proposal. I spent the next few days with an unsettling weight on my shoulders. Every interaction with Zaren was polite, clinical even, but the elephant in the room, so to speak, was impossible to ignore. They were still eagerly awaiting my decision, and I could tell they were growing increasingly curious about my hesitation. After all, the Larassians were known for their relentless pursuit of knowledge, and they couldn't understand why I might be reluctant to engage in what they saw as purely scientific exploration. During one of our research sessions on the biogenetics of Earth's marine life, Zaren casually brought the subject up again, as if we were discussing the weather. Dr. Reynolds, have you had time to contemplate my request? Zaren asked, turning their glowing violet gaze toward me. They were examining the molecular structure of a jellyfish's regeneration cells on a holographic screen, but I could tell their real interest lay in my answer. I stiffened slightly, trying to keep my composure. Yes, I've thought about it. Zaren's scales glimmered in a soft shade of blue, a sure sign of their anticipation. And what are your thoughts? I leaned back in my chair, trying to articulate my response carefully. Zaren, human reproduction isn't just a mechanical process like gene splicing or cellular regeneration. It's deeply tied to our emotions, our relationships, and our sense of intimacy. I understand that your curiosity is purely scientific, but for humans, it's different. Zaren regarded me silently for a moment, their expression unreadable. Different in what way? I sighed, knowing there was no simple way to explain this. For humans, reproduction isn't just about creating offspring. It's an intimate connection between two people, often tied to love or trust. It's emotional, and sometimes it's deeply personal. I don't think it can be reduced to just a scientific experiment. Zaren's eyes widened slightly, their bioluminescent lines pulsing in a contemplative rhythm. Ah, I see. You are concerned about the emotional implications. That is precisely why I wish to understand it, Dr. Reynolds. Our species has long separated emotion from reproduction, viewing it as a purely biological act. But humans seem to place immense value on this emotional connection. If I'm to truly understand your species, I must experience these emotional elements for myself. I struggled to find a response. Zaren's logic was, in a way, unassailable. They weren't asking out of malice or perversion. They genuinely wanted to understand a fundamental aspect of human life. And yet, the proposition still felt deeply uncomfortable. It wasn't just about the act itself, but what it represented to me as a human. You have to understand, I began carefully, that for humans, sharing that kind of experience requires a level of trust and emotional connection that can't just be replicated in a lab setting. Even if you mimic the physical aspects of reproduction, you won't fully grasp the emotional impact unless you truly understand what it means to be human. Zaren's scales shifted to a pale blue, indicating thoughtfulness. Perhaps you are correct. Perhaps I cannot truly understand the full range of human experience without first forming an emotional bond. But I have read much about human relationships. Emotional intimacy is built through shared experiences, is it not? Friendship, trust, cooperation, are these not the building blocks of your species' connections? I nodded slowly. Yes, that's true, but it's not something that can be rushed. Emotional bonds take time to develop. Zaren's gaze softened, and for the first time, I saw something resembling understanding in their alien eyes. Then perhaps that is where I should begin. Before I can fully comprehend human reproduction, I must first learn what it means to form an emotional connection with another being. Their words caught me off guard. Was Zaren suggesting that they wanted to build a friendship or even something deeper before proceeding with their original proposal? The idea was both surprising and oddly reassuring. Perhaps this wasn't just a clinical experiment to them after all. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on the table. If you're truly serious about understanding human emotions, then yes, that's where you should start. Relationships, trust, intimacy, they all take time. They can't be manufactured in a lab. Zaren's bioluminescence flickered gently, and they gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. I understand, Dr. Reynolds. Thank you for your guidance. I will take your advice to heart. For the next few weeks, the topic of reproduction was set aside, and Zaren seemed to shift their focus to understanding human relationships on a more fundamental level. They asked countless questions about friendship, love, and trust, and I found myself explaining concepts I had never thought I'd need to articulate to an alien species. How do you know when you trust someone? Zaren asked one evening while we were walking through the city. The streets were bustling with people, both human and alien, and the neon lights from the towering skyscrapers bathed everything in a soft, colorful glow. It's hard to describe, I admitted. Trust is something that's built over time. It's about knowing that someone has your back, that they'll be there for you when you need them. It's about being vulnerable and knowing that the other person won't take advantage of that. Zaren seemed to contemplate this for a long moment, their glowing scales reflecting the city lights as we walked. Vulnerability, they repeated. That is a concept that is foreign to my species. We are taught from a young age to suppress vulnerability, to rely on logic and reason above all else. I nodded. That's understandable. Different species have different values, but for humans, vulnerability is often a way to build deeper connections. It's how we show trust. Zaren's gaze remained fixed on the bustling crowd around us. And love, is that also tied to vulnerability? I couldn't help but smile at the question. Yeah, it is. Love is complicated. It's not just about attraction or physical connection. It's about caring for someone deeply, wanting what's best for them, and being willing to put their needs above your own. Zaren was silent for a while, their scales shifting between shades of blue and violet as they processed my words. Finally they spoke, their voice softer than usual. I see. Thank you, Dr. Reynolds. I have much to consider. The days turned into weeks, and Zaren's interest in human emotions deepened. They began to ask more personal questions about my life, my relationships, and my experiences. At first, I was hesitant to share too much, but as time went on, I found myself opening up to them in ways I hadn't expected. Despite their alien appearance and mannerisms, Zaren had a way of making me feel understood. They listened intently, never interrupting or judging, and their curiosity seemed genuine. In return, Zaren shared stories of their own culture and upbringing. They told me about the Laurasian education system, which focused heavily on logic, reason, and scientific advancement. Emotions, they explained, were seen as distractions, unnecessary variables that complicated decision-making. But now I see, Zaren said one evening as we sat on my apartment balcony watching the stars twinkle in the night sky, that emotions are not just distractions. They are a fundamental part of the human experience. They shape your actions, your relationships, and even your biology. I nodded, feeling a strange sense of camaraderie with my alien guest. Yeah, they do, and sometimes they're messy, but that's what makes life interesting, I guess. Zaren's gaze remained fixed on the stars, their scales glowing a soft, peaceful blue. I think I'm beginning to understand, Dr. Reynolds. Perhaps one day, I will be ready to fully experience what it means to be human. Chapter 3, Crossing Boundaries. Time passed, and the lines between researcher and subject, between alien and human, began to blur in ways I hadn't anticipated. Zaren's fascination with human emotions had taken a front seat to their original scientific mission, but it was clear that they hadn't forgotten their initial goal. They were simply approaching it from a different angle now, one that I wasn't entirely sure I was prepared for. We had spent countless hours together over the past few months, sharing stories, meals, and discussions about life, relationships, and even what it meant to be vulnerable. Zaren's once distant, clinical demeanor had softened, their bioluminescent scales reflecting a broader spectrum of emotions than I had seen in any Lyrassian before. It was clear that they were no longer simply observing me. They were forming a bond, and it was unlike any relationship I had ever experienced. One evening, after a particularly long day of research, we found ourselves sitting together on my apartment balcony again, staring out into the night sky. The stars above twinkled, a reminder that Earth was but a small speck in a vast galaxy. Yet at that moment, my focus was entirely on the being sitting next to me. Dr. Reynolds, Zaren began, their voice softer than usual. I have been reflecting on our time together. I glanced at them, curious. Oh, what about it? Zaren's scales shifted to a gentle pale violet, the color of introspection in their species. I believe I've come to understand more about human emotions than I initially thought possible. Your species' capacity for vulnerability, trust, and affection is remarkable. It is unlike anything we Lyrassians experience. I nodded, unsure of where they were going with this. I'm glad you've gained some insight. It's not easy to explain, but I think you've done a good job grasping the emotional aspects of human relationships. Zaren turned to face me fully, their violet eyes locking onto mine. But there is one aspect I have not yet fully explored, the physical component, the reproduction process. You spoke of how deeply intertwined emotions and biology are for your species. I believe that to fully comprehend human reproduction, I must experience it as well. There it was, the moment I had been anticipating and dreading since our first conversation about reproduction. Zaren was asking to take the next step, but this time it wasn't just a cold, detached request for scientific knowledge. There was an emotional undercurrent now, one that hadn't been there before. I felt my chest tighten. This was no longer about research. It was about crossing a boundary that I wasn't sure could or should be crossed. Zaren, I began carefully, I don't know if that's a good idea. We've talked about how important emotions are in human relationships, especially when it comes to something as intimate as reproduction. It's not something you can just test. Zaren's scales flickered in shades of blue and violet, a mix of curiosity and contemplation. I understand your hesitation, Dr. Reynolds, but I do not seek to simply mimic the act. I wish to fully experience what it means for a human. I have come to care for you in ways I did not anticipate. This bond we have formed, it is not purely scientific for me anymore. My heart pounded in my chest. Zaren had always been curious, but this was something entirely different. They were talking about emotional connection, something that had been building between us over the past months, slowly and quietly, like a river carving its way through stone. I had tried to ignore it, to tell myself that this was purely a professional relationship, but now there was no denying it. We had crossed into uncharted territory, and I wasn't sure what the consequences would be. I care about you too, Zaren, I admitted, feeling the weight of those words as they left my mouth. But it's complicated. We're from two different species, with different cultures, different values. I don't even know if this kind of thing is possible. Zaren's bioluminescence pulsed gently, a soothing rhythm that I had come to recognize as their way of expressing calm. It is possible, Dr. Reynolds. Our biological systems are different, yes, but I have been studying human anatomy for some time. With the modifications I have made to my body, I can mimic the necessary organs for reproduction. Physically, we are compatible. I stared at them, trying to process what they were saying. Zaren wasn't asking for a mere experiment anymore. They were asking for something deeper, something that went beyond the boundaries of scientific inquiry. But was I ready for that? Could I even comprehend what it would mean to form an intimate connection with a being from another world? Zaren, this isn't just about physical compatibility. I said softly. It's about what it means to be with someone on an emotional level. Humans don't just engage in reproduction for the sake of it. We do it because we care about the person we're with. It's an expression of trust, love, and vulnerability. Zaren's gaze softened, and for a moment I saw something in their eyes that I hadn't seen before, a kind of vulnerability that seemed almost human. I know, Dr. Reynolds. That is why I wish to do this. I have come to care for you, not just as a subject of study, but as a person. I want to understand this connection fully, in all its forms. I felt a lump form in my throat. This was no longer about science. Zaren was asking for something real, something that would change the dynamic between us forever. I wasn't sure if I was ready to take that step, but I also couldn't deny the bond we had formed. It was unconventional, yes, but it was also undeniable. Are you sure this is what you want? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Zaren's scales shimmered with a soft, radiant blue, the color of sincerity. Yes, Dr. Reynolds. I want to experience everything that it means to be human, and I want to share that experience with you. The air between us was thick with tension, but it wasn't the uncomfortable kind. It was the kind that comes when two people or two beings are standing on the precipice of something new, something that neither of them fully understands, but both are drawn to nonetheless. I took a deep breath, knowing that whatever decision I made in this moment would have lasting consequences. This wasn't just about me anymore. It was about Zaren and the connection we had built. It was about what it meant to be human, and perhaps what it meant to be Lyrassian as well. All right, I said finally, my voice steady but my heart racing. If this is truly what you want, then we'll take the next step, but we do this together, not as a scientific experiment, but as two beings who care for each other. Zaren's eyes glowed with warmth, and their scales shimmered with a soft, radiant light that filled the night air around us. Thank you, Dr. Reynolds. I promise I will honor this connection we have formed. And with that, we crossed a boundary that I had never imagined we would. It wasn't about science anymore. It was about something far more profound, something that transcended species and biology. It was about connection, trust, and the possibility of something new, something that neither of us fully understood, but were both willing to explore together. Chapter 4, The First Step. The decision we made that night changed everything. In the days that followed, an unspoken shift occurred between Zaren and me. Our conversations became more personal, more intimate. The questions Zaren asked now weren't just about human biology or culture. They were about emotions, about the complex web of human desires and fears. And to my surprise, I found myself opening up in ways I hadn't anticipated. The weight of what we were about to do pressed on me constantly, and I could see in Zaren's changing bioluminescence that they were also processing the enormity of it. This wasn't just another experiment. It wasn't simply a case study or an intellectual pursuit. We were both standing on the edge of something deeply intimate, something that would transform our relationship and perhaps how we viewed the universe. As we prepared for the next step, Zaren's scientific precision remained intact, but their approach became softer, more thoughtful. There was no rush, no pressure. It was as if they understood, even without being human, that this was a moment that required more than just physical readiness. It required trust. On the night we finally decided to move forward, I couldn't help but feel a nervous tension in the air. Zaren had altered their physiology over the past several weeks, using advanced Lyrassian biotechnological implants and genetic modifications to mimic the necessary organs for human reproduction. It was a feat of science that I could hardly comprehend, and yet, there they stood, looking so human and yet not. Zaren's shimmering silver scales glowed faintly in the low light of the room, their violet eyes watching me with a mixture of curiosity and something else, something I had never seen in them before. It was a kind of vulnerability that mirrored my own. For the first time, Zaren was stepping into unfamiliar territory, not as a researcher, but as a participant in an experience they could not fully control. "Are you sure?" I asked one last time, my voice barely above a whisper. The weight of the moment hung between us, thick and palpable. Zaren's bioluminescence flickered gently, a soothing pattern I had come to associate with their version of calmness. "I am sure, Dr. Reynolds, more than I have ever been." I swallowed hard, my heart pounding in my chest. This wasn't about science anymore. It was about connection, about two beings from different worlds, trusting each other enough to share something deeply personal. We stood facing each other, the silence stretching between us like a vast, uncharted landscape. My mind raced, replaying all the conversations we had over the past months, all the questions and confessions, all the tiny moments where our bond had deepened without either of us realizing it. Zarin reached out slowly, their hand hovering just above mine. "May I?" The question was simple, but its implications were profound. I nodded and Zarin gently took my hand. Their skin, smooth and cool to the touch, was unlike any human's, but in that moment it felt as natural as breathing. We took our time. There was no rush, no urgency. It was as if Zarin instinctively knew that this was not something to be hurried. Every movement, every gesture, was deliberate and careful, as if we were both afraid of breaking the fragile connection we had built. As we proceeded, I couldn't help but marvel at the fact that Zarin had managed to replicate so much of human physiology. Their attention to detail was astounding, and yet there were subtle differences, tiny reminders that they were not human, that they were something else entirely. But instead of feeling strange or alien, it felt right. It was like discovering something new and familiar all at once. Zarin, for their part, seemed to be absorbing every detail of the experience. Their eyes flickered with a soft glow, their bioluminescence shifting in gentle waves as they processed the sensations and emotions that accompanied this moment. It was clear that they were experiencing more than just the physical aspects of human reproduction. They were feeling the emotions, the vulnerability, the trust, and so was I. Afterward, we lay together in a comfortable silence, the weight of what had just happened settling over us like a warm blanket. I stared up at the ceiling, my mind racing with thoughts and emotions I wasn't sure how to process. This was unlike anything I had ever experienced, not just because of the physical aspect, but because of the emotional connection that had formed between us. Zarin's bioluminescent glow pulsed softly beside me, a soothing presence that somehow made me feel at ease. They turned their head toward me, their violet eyes reflecting the dim light in the room. "Dr. Reynolds," they said quietly, "thank you for trusting me." I turned to look at them, my heart still pounding in my chest. "I should be thanking you, Zarin. This wasn't just about you learning something, it was about us connecting." Zarin's scales shifted to a gentle shade of blue, the color of contemplation. "You are right. This experience has given me far more than I anticipated. I understand now what you meant when you said that human reproduction is about more than just biology. It is about trust, vulnerability, and the bonds we form with one another." I nodded, feeling a strange sense of relief wash over me. "Yeah, it is, and I think you understand that now better than most humans do." Zarin's gaze softened, and they reached out to gently touch my hand. "I must admit, Dr. Reynolds, I did not expect to feel this. I thought this would be a purely scientific pursuit, but it has become something more. I care for you in ways I did not know were possible." My breath caught in my throat. Hearing those words from Zarin was both surprising and, in a way, deeply comforting. I had always seen them as a scientist, someone driven by curiosity and logic, but now I realized that they had changed over the course of our time together. They had grown, just as I had. "I care about you too, Zarin," I admitted, my voice soft but steady, more than I thought I would. Zarin's bioluminescence flickered gently, a soft glow that radiated warmth. "Then perhaps this is not the end of our journey together, but the beginning of something new." I smiled, feeling a sense of peace settle over me. Yeah, maybe it is. The days that followed were filled with a quiet sense of contentment. Zarin and I continued our research, but the dynamic between us had shifted. We were no longer just colleagues or even friends. We had crossed a boundary that had deepened our connection in ways I couldn't fully articulate. Zarin, for their part, seemed to be more at ease with their emotions now. They no longer viewed human reproduction as just a scientific curiosity. They understood on a deep, almost instinctual level that it was about much more than biology. It was about trust, vulnerability, and the bonds we form with those we care about. And, in a way, I had come to understand more about myself as well. I had always viewed my work with a certain level of detachment, but now I realized that the connections we form, whether with humans or with beings from other worlds, are what truly make life meaningful. Zarin and I continued to explore the complexities of our relationship, navigating the strange and wonderful intersection between two different species. It wasn't always easy, and there were moments of confusion and doubt, but in the end, we found our way through it together. And in doing so, we discovered something far more profound than either of us had anticipated: the true meaning of connection. Epilogue: The New Frontier. Months later, as Zarin prepared to return to their homeworld, we stood together at the spaceport, reflecting on everything that had happened. Our bond had grown stronger, and though Zarin's research on human reproduction was technically complete, We both knew that our journey was far from over. "I will return," Zarin said softly, their bioluminescent scales glowing in the soft light of the spaceport. "And when I do, I hope we can continue exploring this connection we have formed." I smiled, feeling a sense of hope for the future. "I'll be here waiting." And as Zarin boarded their ship, I couldn't help but wonder what new discoveries lay ahead, not just in the realm of science, but in the vast and uncharted territory of the heart.